so apologies. Just
Not
at
quite,
that end of the panel. And Izzie is the lead climate justice campaigner for Global Justice Now. So over to you, Izzie.
Thank you. Yeah, and as Sarah said, if you can't hear me at the back, put your hand up at any point. So just to start with who Global Justice Now is, for those who don't know, we're a UK-based campaigning organisation fighting for social and environmental justice. And we think that inequality, global inequality, is not inevitable, it's a political choice, and we work as part of a global movement to challenge powerful actors and create a more just and equal world. So that involves mobilising people in the UK to act for change and getting them and acting in solidarity with those fighting injustice, be that groups, movements, workers in the UK, or particularly activists and movements in the global south. And our power is really in our grassroots networks, who are all across the UK and mobilise campaigning for global change in their local areas. So obviously, all that being said, climate justice is a really big area for us, and that's what I want to talk about today, to kind of think through how this trade union climate campaign and movement can be part of a bigger movement for global solidarity and global climate justice. And our campaigning on climate justice is really based on asking who is responsible for climate change. As many of you know, I'm sure historical emissions are far higher in wealthier industrialised nations, and those nations and corporations located there in places like the UK have profited and continue to profit from climate destruction. A lot of this relates to carbon inequality. As much as 92% of carbon emissions that exceed safe planetary limits come from the global north, and actually the world's richest 10% of people were responsible for more than half of the carbon added to the atmosphere between 1990 and 2015. So that's a huge disparity in terms of who's actually driving this issue. And the UK, specifically, the contribution to historic emissions has been huge, with the fourth highest historic emitting country, having released well over 100 billion tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere. And if you compare that to somewhere like Tuvalu, which is a Pacific Island state, highly vulnerable to the climate crisis, by 2021 it had produced just over 286,000 tonnes of carbon. So to remind you, that's compared to the UK's over 100 billion. And in Tuvalu, rising sea levels are such a concern that the phrase "Tuvalu is sinking" has become a local catchphrase. Science is showing that it could become uninhabitable by 2050, and the government is actually drawing up plans to exist as an online state for its peoples when they are displaced en masse by the climate crisis. So you can really see how a small group of people are actually driving this crisis while being relatively cushioned from its impacts. And emissions are really unavoidably tied to the global economy. Colonialism has doubled the UK's historic emissions, the emissions that have been created by colonies when they were colonised by the UK. And we know that colonising countries also made huge profits from their empires. So estimates show Britain drained $45 trillion from India alone during its colonial rule. And we really see how that dynamic still persists today, with the super rich and powerful kind of living the high life and causing the climate crisis and profiting from it too. And then countries that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis being the least responsible for it, and also on top of that, often being on the front lines of the harms of fossil fuel extraction. So if you look at Nigeria, for instance, which is experiencing really extreme heat waves, also the Niger Delta, where Shell, a UK company, has concentrated a lot of its oil operations, is one of the most polluted areas on Earth because of repeated oil spills into the local environment there. So clearly we're looking at a really complex, well-embedded problem, and we know that it's one that requires fast action. So it feels really daunting, and it's really great to come to events like this and be part of these conversations with so many people trying to think through how we actually manage this process. And we really strongly believe there are ways out of this. Global Justice Now is currently calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which is a global call to get governments to come together and make a plan to manage the energy transition properly. And this was spearheaded by Pacific Island states. So if we're kind of talking about global solidarity, these are countries where the climate crisis is really urgently existential, and if they are using their limited time to call for something, we should be standing with them. Other governments have now joined this call as well, including Colombia, which was the first fossil fuel producing country to endorse the treaty. And it's a proposal for a treaty, it's not written yet, but there are 3 pillars that governments are committing to, which is no new fossil fuel expansion, a fair phase out of existing fossil fuel use, and a globally just transition. And I think that third pillar of a globally just transition is really important in this conversation that we're all having here today, because when we say globally just, we mean for everyone, from workers in the UK to communities in the global south on the front lines of the climate crisis. And what we really need governments to do in order to make that a reality is to actually plan to, help workers transition rather than basically using the concerns, the valid concerns and worries of workers about how this transition is going to work as a kind of excuse to basically culture war the climate crisis without coming up with any useful ideas as to how to manage it. We want them to be grown-ups and be leaders and come together to plan a globally just and fair transition for workers and communities all around the world, so that workers aren't left stranded and the global south, it doesn't become a sacrifice zone for the climate crisis and an extractive global economy. So what's really needed is for us all to stand together and make this demand of our governments locally and nationally, and to really drive that greater ambition around the energy transition in the UK that is fair and just for everyone, from the UK to Nigeria to Tuvalu, all around the world, and to tell our governments they need to act today.